On Tuesday last week, the Love Triangle murder trial entered day 8 in Austin, Texas. We are finally getting caught up. This is the trial of Texas v. Kaitlin Armstrong, where the defendant is accused of murdering a woman named Mo Wilson. Mo was a professional cyclist and had briefly dated Kaitlin's then-boyfriend Colin Strickland when Kaitlin and Colin were on one of their numerous off periods in their relationship. After being questioned by the police, Kaitlin sold her Jeep and flew to Costa Rica on her sister's passport, where she dyed her hair and got plastic surgery to her face. If you are new to this case, there is a playlist to all of the prior videos on it in the description below, so you can totally get caught up real quick. Anyway, on day 8, the jury heard from 6 more prosecution witnesses. Through one of these witnesses, the jury got to see the infamous video footage of Kaitlin fleeing the doctor's office just a couple weeks before starting trial. And at the end of day 8, the prosecution put on a final witness who was able to basically tie together all of the digital receipts and package them with a beautiful bow, so to speak, so that the jury could easily understand all of that data. Let's get into it. The first witness of the day was Stephen Aston, who continued his testimony from day 7. Mr. Aston is a forensic scientist who specializes in weapons testing. And on the morning of day 8, the defense continued his cross-examination. Remember that his testimony is important because it has the capability of convincing the jury that not only was Kaitlin stalking Mo on May 11th, 2022, but that Kaitlin ended up in Cash's apartment where Mo was murdered. And so the defense spent more time on day 8 really tearing into Mr. Aston's credentials and into the field of ballistics in general. For example, the defense teased out that Mr. Aston doesn't know how certain gun components are manufactured. This does definitely create some doubt as to how well Mr. Aston can truly analyze how unique a firearm can be. So in the day 7 recap, I indicated that Mr. Aston's testimony left a little bit to be desired for the prosecution. And on day 8, I think this continues to be the case. Okay, so the second witness of the day was Dr. Bernadette Derussy. Dr. Derussy is the deputy medical examiner for the Travis County Medical Examiner's Office. And so I'm sure you can guess that this is the part of the trial where they show the jury all of the autopsy photos. I'll save all the gory details, save for the ones that are basically necessary in order to understand what they talked about. There were 4 gunshot wounds. The first one that Dr. Derussy noted was a wound to the right side of Mo's face near her nose. This had an exit wound on the left side of her jaw, which indicated a somewhat downward movement of the bullet. The second wound was a gunshot wound to Mo's right temporal scalp, and the exit wound there was the area beneath the chin, so again, downward. And the third wound was a gunshot wound to the left side of the chest. It entered through the chest right above the heart and exited out the back. And the nature of this exit wound suggested that when this shot was fired, Mo was already on the ground where she was ultimately found by Cash and first responders. Anyway, the fourth wound was a gunshot wound of the right index finger. There's a suggestion that this may have been a defensive wound, meaning an injury sustained when a person is trying to protect themselves. But the medical examiner said that she couldn't be certain if this injury was in fact a defensive wound. And so it's no surprise here that the medical examiner concluded that Mo died by gunshot wounds. Now, interestingly, Dr. Derussy said that she couldn't determine the distance of the shots fired. This is because in order to determine that, she usually looks for muzzle imprint, soot, or abrasions around the entrance wound. And so she said that she didn't want to speculate about the distance of the shots fired in this case. But usually when she can't determine a distance, it's because the gun was shot more than 2 to 3 feet away, or something like clothing was blocking it. Okay, so the third witness was Officer Rosalba Johnson from the Travis County Sheriff's Office. She is assigned to the hospital visitation unit. And so she was the one that was responsible for transporting Kaitlin to the doctor's appointment that Kaitlin infamously escaped from a couple weeks before trial. Officer Johnson explained that normally leg irons are used for these kinds of transports. But on this occasion, Kaitlin provided a note from a doctor who instructed them not to use leg irons because of the nature of the orthopedic visit. This note was later verified to be real and accurate, not a forgery. But after the appointment, Officer Johnson said that she opened the door of the doctor's office building so that they could exit. And in that moment, Kaitlin was between Officer Johnson and her partner. And then a nurse approached her to say that they had forgotten some paperwork. Then all of a sudden, Officer Johnson's partner said Kaitlin was escaping, and they both chased after her. Officer Johnson said that Kaitlin was eventually captured in a driveway about a half a mile away. And she also said that when Kaitlin was actually caught, she appeared to be calm. She said nothing, and she didn't even seem winded from the short fun run that she took. And so, of course, the jury also got to see the video footage that was taken of Kaitlin escaping from Officer Johnson's partner. All right, so the next witness here was Alejandra Gil, a forensic DNA scientist with the Texas Department of Public Safety. Remember how I previously said that there are two key pieces that the prosecution needs to show that Kaitlin did more than just stalk Mo on May 11th, but that she found her way into Kaitlin Cash's apartment. One of those two key pieces was the ballistics of the casings that were found at the crime scene and linking those casings to Kaitlin's 9mm 6 Sauer. And the other, I said, was going to be DNA evidence found on the handlebars of Mo's bicycle. So here we're getting into that second piece. Now, with the ballistics testimony being somewhat of a weak point in the prosecution's case, the state is definitely going to want to give a hefty serving of DNA testimony to the jury to pin Kaitlin as the murderer. Specifically, Ms. Gil testified that she was responsible for collecting and packaging the DNA samples. She says she did not perform the DNA analysis. That testimony will come from another witness. But here, Ms. Gil said that they examined DNA swab submissions from 8 different locations. These included swabs from the bicycle handlebars, the bicycle seat, the underside of the bicycle seat, the firearm grip, the trigger guard, the safety, the magazine release and slide of the firearm, the magazine base and loading port of the firearm, the exterior of some gum wrapper, and known saliva from Kaitlin, Colin, and Cash, and known blood standard for Mo. And then there were more swabs that they took from around the crime scene as well, but you get the picture. But one thing that she explained here was the concept of shedding DNA. Ms. Gil said that when you touch an item, it's often the case that you leave behind DNA. Some people tend to leave more DNA behind than others, and it all depends on the rate at which your skin sheds. But to explain the analysis of this DNA, the state called the next witness of the day, Samantha Perkins. Ms. Perkins is the DNA supervisor and technical leader for the Texas Department of Public Safety. She started out with a basic explanation of what DNA is. For some reason, my brain is envisioning the DNA presentation in Jurassic Park, and it does not want to allow anyone to convince me that Miss Perkins' presentation was anything different.
Oh, Mr. DNA, where did you come from?
From your blood. Just one drop of your blood contains billions of strands of DNA.
Anyway, she also said the DNA analysis is done in 4 steps. Extraction, quantification, amplification, and detection generation/interpretation of the DNA profile. And so Ms. Perkins went through each of those steps to explain how she analyzed the DNA in this case. And what she said is that they use a software that helps to interpret the samples and eventually perform a statistical calculation called a likelihood ratio to determine how likely it is that the DNA they swabbed is a match. When determining a likelihood ratio, the medical examiner said that they basically looked at 2 probabilities. The first is the prosecution's hypothesis, which is that the DNA came from the defendant. And the second is the defense's hypothesis, which is that the DNA came from literally anyone but the defendant. Now, an important thing that she said early on in her testimony is that there's no such thing as a 100% match. The technology simply does not exist to provide that level of certainty. Instead, there's a nationally recognized term that is used, which is very strong support. This is the highest likelihood that a DNA match exists. So that's what they're looking for when analyzing here. A lot of the swabs ended up with unidentifiable DNA results, but a few swabs had some very interesting results. Looking at the handlebars of Mo's bicycle, the DNA profile has 3 contributions of genetic material: Mo, Kaitlin, and an unidentified individual. The unidentified individual is not Colin and it's not Kaitlin Cash. But according to the analysis, there is strong support that Kaitlin's DNA is a match on the handlebars. And that's not all. When they tested the swabs from the bicycle seat, there again was DNA from Mo and an unidentified individual. And there was very strong support that there was DNA from Kaitlin. So strong support that it's Kaitlin's DNA on the handlebars, very strong support that it's Kaitlin's DNA on the bicycle seat. And once again, Cash and Colin were both ruled out from the sample. After this, they talked about the sample that was taken from the firearm grip, the trigger guard, safety, magazine release, and slide serrations. Kaitlin and Colin were determined to be possible DNA contributors to these swabs. Cash and Mo, on the other hand, were ruled out. Now, in cross-examination, the defense was obviously very, very interested in reducing the weight and credibility of this evidence. This is because if it's convincing to the jury, it shows that not only were Kaitlin's devices found following Mo all day on May 11th up to the point of her death, but that Kaitlin's DNA was found on an item that previously was locked away inside Cash's apartment. And the only way of getting it is by going inside. The defense started out by pointing out that a DNA test does not tell you when or how the DNA got there, just that it exists. Which is normally fine, I guess, except that in this case, Mo and Kaitlin were not two people who were ever spending any time around one another. So there really was no good logical reason for Kaitlin's DNA to be on Mo's bicycle, which again was being stored inside Cash's apartment. This was not just some bicycle that would be tethered to a bike rack in downtown Austin, where some DNA could end up on it by chance. The most logical conclusion here is that the reason Kaitlin's DNA was on the bicycle was because she went into Cash's apartment and took the bicycle out, most likely after shooting Mo. However, the defense goes into the idea of transfer DNA. This is where a person might touch one item, then leave that item behind. Then someone else might walk up and touch the same item and also leave it behind, but not before taking that person's DNA with them on their hand, for example. Then when that second person goes to touch another item, they transfer that first person's DNA to that second item that the first person never actually touched. You can see why this is a great theory from the defense perspective. It gives them an opportunity to open up some doubt as to how much the jury can really conclude about this DNA evidence. Here, the defense put forward the possibility that Kaitlin's DNA was already in Colin's motorcycle helmet when Mo used it to go to Deep Eddy's in Poolburger. And so the argument goes, the DNA then got from Mo's hair to her hands, where she eventually put her hands on the bicycle. But in my opinion, it's still a really hard argument to make given how well the prosecution's DNA finding fits with all of the digital receipts and the surveillance footage and all of that. Okay, so the next witness was Pamela Mazak, and her testimony was absolutely crucial to tie together all of the digital receipts and surveillance footage for the prosecution. Ms. Mazak is a criminal intelligence analyst with the Cold Case and Missing Persons Unit from the Texas Attorney General's office. Ms. Mazak helped analyze the cell phones and extraction data that the APD got from the Secret Service. To do this, she used databases from cell phone companies. The data included call detail records, which document interactions to and from a phone. This includes information like date, time, duration, number called, and calling number. And basically, call detail records use cell towers to pinpoint cell placement. There is a limit as to just how accurate these can get, but for the purposes of this case, the accuracy is more than enough to understand where these different individuals were and how alarming it is that Kaitlin was in the different places that she was that day. Basically, the gist of all of this is that Ms. Mazak was able to map out the cell phone location of Kaitlin, Colin, and Mo on and around May 11th, 2022. Kaitlin's data was mapped in yellow, Colin's in blue, and Mo's in green. Looking at the data starting on May 9th, 2022, they were able to get a ton of detail on Kaitlin's stalking behavior. On the 9th, Kaitlin viewed Mo's Strava profile once. And the next day, the day before Mo's killing, Kaitlin viewed it 4 times. Next, Ms. Mazak testified about the movement of Kaitlin's, Colin's, and Mo's digital devices. Ms. Mazak did go into detail about the entire day, but I want to focus on the evening because it's really the most salient in my opinion. So we'll go through the specific timestamps that they went over starting in the evening. At 5:40 p.m., Colin arrived at Cash's apartment to pick up Mo. The data on Cash's lock says Mo locked the door at 5:55, indicating they left about 15 minutes after Colin arrived. Mo and Colin's cell phones then move away from Cash's home, arriving at Deep Eddy at 6:09 p.m. All this time, Kaitlin apparently has been home through 6:15 p.m. At 6:24 p.m., Kaitlin calls Colin. No answer. Kaitlin then texts Colin and she gets no response. The entire time that Kaitlin has been trying to reach Colin, he's been at the Deep Eddy pool. Approximately 10 minutes later, at 6:33 p.m., Kaitlin's Jeep leaves home and heads down South Lamar. Then it stops at one location until 6:54 p.m. Then, around 6:57 p.m., Mo and Colin head to Poolburger. At 7:15 p.m., Kaitlin's Jeep moves on South Lamar, this time going north. Then around 7:30 p.m., Kaitlin's Jeep crosses Lady Bird Lake into downtown Austin. Over the next roughly 10 minutes, Kaitlin's Jeep takes a number of turns through downtown Austin. Then at about 7:30 p.m., the phone goes off network. This means that the network can no longer communicate with the phone. And the next time that the phone is detected back on network is 9:55 p.m. And here's the thing, the defense wants the jury to believe that there's a good possibility that someone else could be driving Kaitlin's Jeep. But Ms. Mazak testified that the Jeep's GPS data and Kaitlin's cell phone data corroborate one another while the cell phone is on. Obviously, that corroboration isn't there when the cell phone is turned off, But it is still very much a steep hill to climb to try to argue that somehow during that period of time, just that little window right there, that some random person is driving Kaitlin's car. It just remains the most logical conclusion to say that Kaitlin continued to be the driver of the Jeep while her phone was off. So back to the Jeep at 7:30 p.m. It continues driving, of course. It eventually heads to the I-35. And yes, I do have a tendency to put the in front of most highway names. It's kind of a California thing, I think, mostly a California thing. I learned this when I was actually living in Austin and was routinely made fun of by my friends for it. But whatever, it's a habit. It's probably never going to change. Anyway, the Jeep then goes north on Frontage Road and then east on MLK towards Cash's place. It circles the block twice using the alleys around Cash's apartment. And then it stops on a road nearby. And although there's no cell phone data to corroborate the Jeep's GPS, there is, of course, a lot of surveillance video footage from the neighbors around Cash's apartment. The Jeep shows up at 8:05, 8:06, and 8:08 p.m. on these various cameras. Then around 8:16 p.m., Colin's and Mo's phones leave Poolburger. Remember that this is corroborated by more video surveillance. At 8:26 p.m., Kaitlin's Jeep is seen on video surveillance a few doors away from Cash's apartment. At 8:28 p.m., Colin and Mo arrive at Cash's apartment. At this point in time, Colin's and Mo's phones and Kaitlin's Jeep GPS are all within a few hundred feet of one another. At this point, the Jeep is stationary for about 3.5 minutes. Then at 8:35, Colin's phone moves north. At the same time, Mo's phone stays at Cash's apartment. At 8:36 p.m., Colin texts Kaitlin his false alibi, and Mo unlocks Cash's front door. At 8:37 p.m., Kaitlin's Jeep is seen driving in the alley next to Cash's apartment. Mo begins using some apps on her phone within a few minutes of walking in the door. At 8:41 p.m., Kaitlin's Jeep pulls out of the alley and parks where it stays until 9:17 p.m. Interestingly, Ms. Mazak testified that this is also the approximate location where Mo's bicycle was later found. Anyway, at 8:50, 15 minutes after leaving Cash's apartment, Colin's phone arrives at home. At 9:07 p.m., Colin receives an incoming call from Alan Burrows, who the jury previously heard from. This call lasts 9 minutes. At 9:13 p.m., Mo sends her final text messages. At 9:16 p.m., one of Cash's neighbors' Ring app picks up a woman's screams, and then 2 gunshots, a pause, and a 3rd gunshot. At 9:21 p.m., Colin texts Kaitlin. She does not respond. Kaitlin's Jeep then travels north on the I-35 all the way to Highway 290 before turning around and driving south towards South Austin, again via the I-35. At 9:43 p.m. for 3 minutes, Kaitlin's Jeep stops at a dumpster near an apartment complex before heading home. At 9:47 p.m., Kaitlin arrives home. 7 minutes later, at 9:54 p.m., Cash calls 911. 1 minute after that, at 9:55 p.m., Kaitlin's phone is turned back on and goes on network. This is absolutely damning for the defense. On cross-examination, the defense tried to express to the jury that Ms. Mazak couldn't definitively tell that Kaitlin was driving her Jeep and carrying her phone with her. But they also didn't tease any kind of plausible explanation for who else could be driving Kaitlin's Jeep or using her phone. It's also interesting that Kaitlin turned off her phone at 7:30 p.m. while driving through downtown Austin. The fact that she later turned on her phone after arriving at home suggests to me, and I'm speculating here, but it does possibly signify that that is when she developed an intent to murder Mo, when she turned it off. If Kaitlin had been stalking Mo's Strava and she had been regularly stalking Colin's tweets through his iCloud account, she'd have all the information needed to carry out the crime long before. But it might be knowing that Mo and Colin were getting together for dinner and maybe going for a swim, and then not hearing from Colin after she had texted and called him. This might be the final thing that set her off and led her to this decision. I've said before that I disagree with the prosecution's idea that she formed this plan to kill Mo back in December 2021 when she bought the Sig Sauer and started training with it. But this could be the moment. Either way, this is excellent testimony put together by the prosecution to really sum up all of the pieces of digital evidence and package them in a way that the jury can understand fully. And this is a perfect witness to have as one of their last witnesses to testify. Remember, the jury is made up of human beings who are subject to the latency and recency effect. And so they're more likely to remember the witnesses that they heard from first and last. The state hasn't yet rested their case on day 8, but my goodness, this would be a perfect witness to end with. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? Is this case done and done at this point, or do you still have questions that you think might be answered or maybe broadened by the defense during their case in chief? Let us know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more trial recaps like this, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is uploaded. See you in the next one.